Hello and welcome to this video presentation providing an overview of the Hangar 1 and Moffett Federal Airfield leasing opportunity. My name is David Hasse and I'm the project manager for this effort on behalf of GSA and NASA. In this presentation I'm going to cover the highlights of the leasing opportunity and provide some information regarding the planned Request for Proposals, or RFP, that will be issued by GSA shortly. I will also discuss the schedule that outlines key milestones for the RFP. At the end of the presentation, an email address will be specified so that you may submit to GSA any questions and comments that you may have. First, I'd like to cover the government's goals and objectives of the leasing opportunity. NASA, as the landlord of the Ames Research Center and Moffett Federal Airfield, has asked GSA to assist with the RFP process and to be involved in the selection of a tenant. The primary objective is to identify and select an offeror that has the technical and financial capacity to reside and rehabilitate Hangar 1 in a manner that will meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. The second major goal is to enter into a lease agreement with a partner to eliminate NASA's operation and maintenance cost of the airfield. NASA does have arrangements in place with existing airfield users to obtain payment for reimbursable services. However, there are still some costs that NASA is burdened with in managing the airfield, a property that is not needed for mission purposes. The next objective is to obtain the expertise of the real estate development industry and private financing to stimulate new uses of the airfield and Hangar 1. By encouraging private investment, it is expected that new uses will be identified to reposition the property to serve local demand. NASA, as the landlord, is also seeking to receive rent over the length of the lease in addition to facilitating the resiting of Hangar 1 and eliminating NASA costs. GSA and NASA are conducting the RFP process to seek competitive proposals that will be evaluated comparatively to ensure that the government's identified goals are met. While the government will not reveal proposals until a selection is made, the RFP process will allow for all interested parties ample time to develop proposals, and the RFP will indicate what criteria the government evaluators will use in selecting a preferred tenant. Next, let's talk about the authority in which NASA will enter into the lease with the preferred selected tenant. Since the primary objective of the lease is to reside and rehabilitate Hangar 1, a property that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, NASA will be using Section 111 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Under that section of the Act, all federal agencies, including NASA and GSA, are authorized to enter into lease agreements to provide for the rehabilitation of historic properties. The one distinction between the Section 111 authority and other leasing authorities that NASA has used in the past at Ames is that this authority does not require a connection to ongoing NASA missions. While an offeror could have uses or subleases that are coupled with NASA research efforts, it is not a requirement. The tenant only needs to be charged with the rehabilitation of historic properties. Lastly, Section 111 allows for the use of net rent proceeds to be used for rehabilitation and maintenance of other historic properties, including buildings at Ames or at other historic properties NASA controls. The RFP will outline two leasing options that could be considered. The preferred option is to lease Hangar 1 and the Moffett Federal Airfield. This will provide for the maximum property that is not needed for NASA mission purposes to be leased, but ensure the federal government and other users of the airfield, including the California Air National Guard, can continue its use. The tenant will likely consist of a multidisciplinary team to conduct the resiting and to manage airfield operations. The second option is to lease just Hangar 1 in order for the tenant to reside the iconic structure, construct any improvements, and to utilize the property for its use. The tenant would have limited use of the airfield. Under both options, the tenant would be required to reside Hangar 1 since that is the rationale for using Section 111. The resiting will need to be in conformance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties, and that action would require consultation with the California State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO. Since the property will be owned by the government, NASA would be an active participant in the consultation process to ensure that Hangar 1 is rehabilitated. As mentioned earlier, NASA and GSA are seeking to complete a competitive offering, and GSA will issue an RFP to allow for potential competition among interested parties. The RFP package is in development for a release soon. The RFP's availability will be widely announced and will be posted on www.fbo.gov. The RFP, along with other due diligence information, will be posted on a dedicated website hosted by NASA. That URL will be specified in advertising and media releases. Since the RFP is a government lease solicitation, specific details are not being provided until it is released and available for all interested parties. However, this slide provides general parameters for the information that will be in the RFP. The RFP will describe the offered lease premises and any restrictions. It will identify tenant responsibilities, including resiting Hangar 1, obtaining utilities, and eliminating NASA's costs. Offerors will be expected to propose uses that would conform with the 2002 NASA Ames Development Plan and the final Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement. The RFP will specify the evaluation criteria that proposals will need to meet by identifying specific information that will need to be contained in the proposals. Lastly, there will be a schedule of events so offerors will be able to provide timely responses, and it sets out the time frame in which we would evaluate the proposals. As I mentioned, the government is seeking to enter into a long-term lease. NASA, as the landlord, will manage the lease and provide reimbursable services to the tenant, but will be flexible to allow the tenant to manage the property to meet both the government's and the tenant's goals. The adjacent California Air National Guard property will be excluded from the lease. NASA already has a long-term agreement with the California Air Guard, and they will be allowed to continue using the airfield. There are several agreements with partners that use the airfield that will either expire according to the lease term or be assigned to the new tenant. The tenant will be able to renegotiate terms with these users if it is desirable to keep these arrangements in place. The tenant will be able to sublease the property to new partners or service providers. NASA would not be a party to those agreements and would not provide services directly to those subleased tenants. The tenant would be wholly responsible for all direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are arrangements made by the tenant with service providers or vendors. Indirect costs are services that NASA will or is able to provide, but would be subject to full reimbursement. NASA will not be providing any financial assistance to support the resiting of Hangar 1 or the tenant's operations. Moffett Federal Airfield is impacted by contamination caused by former uses on adjacent property and when the property was an active military installation. It is expected that the Navy will continue to take actions to meet its commitment to protect human health and the environment. The tenant will be required to provide access to the Navy and may not have full use of the property that is being remediated. Since the Hangar 1 siding was removed to address contamination, and that Navy's remedy included the encapsulation of residual contamination through the application of an epoxy coating on the steel frame, the tenant will need to coordinate its resiting plan with Navy, NASA, and the State Historic Preservation Office. It is expected that the siding will not detrimentally impact the coating, and the tenant will assume long-term management responsibilities of the remedy. The RFP will lay out a schedule for proposals to be submitted and to indicate the evaluation process. I'm highlighting the key milestones here based upon the issuance of the RFP in spring 2013. Offerors will have 120 days to complete necessary due diligence, form any necessary partnerships, and submit proposals to GSA. Property tours will be conducted during this period. Upon receipt of proposals, the government team, consisting of both NASA and GSA representatives, will take approximately 60 days to evaluate and select the preferred tenant. After notification, the preferred tenant will be authorized to negotiate a lease agreement with NASA and to participate in consultations with the SHPO. While the RFP will include language that will serve as the framework for the lease agreement, NASA and the tenant need additional time to fine-tune the lease to reflect the selected proposal. This phase will be approximately 120 business days. It is expected that the lease will be executed within 30 days after an agreement with SHPO is established. This concludes the presentation regarding the planned leasing opportunity for Hangar 1 and Moffett Federal Airfield. We welcome your comments or questions to this presentation and may be provided by email to hangar1@gsa.gov. Thank you for your interest in this exciting project.